If you drop before the timer runs out, little brother, I will personally drive the bulldozer tomorrow morning and flatten that pathetic garbage dump you call a veteran camp. My brother, Declan, sneered, his voice carrying over the gentle hum of the string quartet playing in the background. He slowly reached into the inner pocket of his custom-tailored Italian suit, retrieved a pristine leather checkbook, and scrawled his signature with a gold fountain pen. He tore the check for $50,000 free. Then, with a deliberate flick of his wrist, he tossed it directly onto the wet, muddy grass at my feet. Step in here and survive 3 minutes in the ring with me. Prove you are a man, Hayes. Prove those broken soldiers of yours are worth saving. That was the ultimatum delivered to me in the middle of my parents' lavish 40th anniversary party. We were standing on the sprawling, perfectly manicured back lawn of the Kensington estate. Around us, the elite guests, politicians, real estate tycoons, and socialites wearing silk gowns and diamond necklaces, clapped and hollered like they were tourists watching a violent blood sport in some ancient arena. The sheer cruelty of the moment was intoxicating to them. Even my own mother and father, Rowena and Alistair, stood by the outdoor marble bar and raised their expensive crystal champagne glasses. They were genuinely thrilled, their faces flushed with excitement at the prospect of watching their 6'4" heavyweight MMA champion son physically humiliate the family disgrace. Declan cracked his massive knuckles, rolling his broad shoulders under his expensive dress shirt. He looked down at my faded denim and mud-stained boots with utter revulsion. He thought he was about to get 180 seconds to shatter a terrified lamb. He expected me to cower, to beg, to fold in on myself the way I did when we were children. He forgot one brutal truth. The boy he used to terrorize died a long time ago. I quietly unlaced my heavy combat boots, tossing them aside. I placed my bare, calloused feet onto the imported grass, looked up straight into his cold, dead eyes, and my lips curled into a faint smile. Are you sure you can last 3 minutes? But what Declan did not know in that moment was that I was not trembling from fear. I was physically vibrating from the immense effort it took to hold back the dark instincts of an awakened beast. I had spent years learning how to neutralize threats in the deadliest environments on Earth, and right now, the biggest threat to my family was standing right in front of me, wearing a smug grin. Before I tell you exactly what happened inside that makeshift arena, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel, but only if you have ever had your own flesh and blood turn their backs on you when you needed them most. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from today, and tell me if you have ever had to cut ties with toxic family members to protect your own peace. Standing there on that pristine lawn, the overwhelming scent of designer cologne, roasted duck, and expensive imported alcohol hit my senses like a physical blow. It dragged me backward, pulling me 20 years into the past against my will. That exact same twisted, condescending smirk on Declan's face had lived in the darkest corners of my nightmares for 2 decades. It was the smirk of a boy groomed from birth to believe he owned the earth, and that everyone else was merely placed here to serve him. My bare feet sank into the soft grass. The skin on my soles was rough, scarred from shrapnel, and heavily calloused from years of forced marches in sweltering foreign deserts. Standing there, I could feel the suffocating weight of the Kensington family legacy pressing down on my shoulders all over again. The towering marble pillars of the mansion behind us, the endless whispering in the grand hallways, the persistent agonizing feeling of being an unwanted intruder in the very house where I was born. It all came rushing back in a tidal wave of awful memories. He stared at me now the exact same way he did when we were kids. He looked at me like a defective toy he was eager to smash against a brick wall. Yet, for a fraction of a second, the sheer malice in his gaze threatened to paralyze the ghost of my inner child. The atmosphere was thick with tension. The crowd murmured around us, a sea of wealthy vultures waiting for a carcass. Their faces were twisted in disgust at my faded denim, my worn-out work jacket, and the dirt under my fingernails. They did not care that I was fighting for the lives of broken men. They only wanted a spectacle. They wanted to see the outcast put in his place. I looked at my father, Alistair, who was chuckling with a local senator, pointing his cigar in my direction. I looked at my mother, Rowena, who was fixing her diamond earrings, annoyed that my presence was delaying the catering service. How did a bloodline meant to protect and nurture its own become so incredibly toxic? How did these people convince themselves that money and status excused basic human decency? The air felt heavy, suffocating. I took a slow, deep breath, letting the oxygen fill my lungs, forcing my heart rate to slow down. I was no longer a frightened teenager. I was a Marine captain, and I was about to teach my family a lesson about real survival. When I was just a kid, the brutal hierarchy of the Kensington estate was already carved in solid stone. It was a caste system strictly enforced every single day by my parents. My older brother Declan was the untouchable, infallible golden child. He was loud, aggressive, fiercely competitive, and commanded every room he walked into by sheer force of volume and intimidation. Every minor sports trophy he won, every ruthless tackle he made on the high school football field, was celebrated with massive, lavish banquets that filled our sprawling estate with cheering politicians, business partners, and local celebrities. His golden cups, championship belts, and varsity letters were displayed in a custom-built, illuminated glass case in the grand foyer. They were lit up like holy relics, positioned right by the front door so every guest could marvel at the physical superiority of the Kensington heir. Meanwhile, my existence in that house was a quiet, inconvenient footnote. I was a straight-A student, a quiet, observant kid who preferred to build things and understand how the world worked rather than dominate it. But my academic awards, my science fair ribbons, and my mechanical design certificates were never displayed. They were never even acknowledged. Once, when I was 12, I came home from school to find a stack of my statewide math achievement certificates stuffed into the bottom of a trash can in the downstairs study. Aunt Delphine, a woman who wore far too much perfume and judged everyone by their bank account, had thrown them away. When I asked her why, she casually claimed they were cluttering up the mahogany desk and making the room look messy. My mother stood right there, sipping her tea, and nodded in agreement, telling me to stop whining over pieces of paper. I learned very early on to walk the sprawling, echoing hallways of that mansion without making a single sound. I became a ghost in my own home. If I spoke up at the dinner table with an idea or a thought, I was scolded for interrupting the adults or being too sensitive. If I stayed silent, I was entirely ignored. I existed in the shadows, watching my parents actively groom my brother. They praised his bullying behavior at school, calling it natural leadership. They excused his cruelty toward other children as a necessary killer instinct required for the corporate world. They were building a ruthless capitalist predator, and I was just an accidental byproduct of their marriage, a spare heir lacking the required viciousness. The turning point, the defining moment the illusion of family safety shattered forever, happened right after my 16th birthday. I had spent 6 grueling months working weekend shifts at a local hardware store, sweeping floors and carrying heavy bags of cement, saving every single dime to buy a vintage V8 engine block. I spent every night in the dusty, forgotten corner of our massive 4-car garage, painstakingly restoring it. I cleaned every valve, replaced the gaskets, and polished the metal until it shined. I poured all my desperate need for validation, all my lonely energy, into those greasy metal parts. It was a masterpiece of mechanical engineering, my ultimate pride and joy, a tangible proof that I could create something beautiful from ruin. One lazy Sunday afternoon, Declan walked into the garage with a few of his hulking high school football friends. He saw the engine sitting on my wooden workbench, fully assembled and gleaming under the fluorescent lights. He did not say a word to me. He did not ask what it was. He just picked up a heavy steel sledgehammer resting nearby, flashed that familiar malicious grin to his friends, and began smashing my engine to pieces. He swung the heavy hammer over and over again with brutal, terrifying force. The sound of cracking metal echoed like gunshots. He shattered the manifold, cracked the cast iron block, and destroyed 6 months of my blood, sweat, and tears in a matter of seconds. He did not do it out of anger. He did not do it because we had an argument. He did it simply because he could. He did it to prove to his friends that my creations, my hard work, meant nothing in the face of his destructive physical power. When I stood there trembling, staring at the ruined, jagged metal with hot tears stinging my eyes. My parents walked into the garage drawn by the noise. They saw the destruction. They saw Declan holding the hammer. They did not yell at him. They did not punish him or demand he pay me back. My father, Alistair, just swirled the expensive scotch in his crystal glass, looked at the mess, and sighed in deep annoyance. He looked at my wet eyes and sneered. "Stop acting so incredibly weak, Hayes. It is just a piece of junk metal. You need to learn how to take a joke. You are far too soft to carry the Kensington name. Clean up this mess before the caterers arrive for dinner." It was in that exact crushing moment that I truly understood the twisted, diseased psychology of my family. Empathy, creation, and vulnerability were considered fatal flaws in this house. They viewed Declan's pure malice as strength, and they viewed my tears as a pathetic, unforgivable weakness. Declan's relentless bullying was not just normal sibling rivalry. It was a symptom of his own deep insecurity. He was terrified of my quiet intelligence, terrified that my independence would overshadow his loud, hollow bravado. So he used physical violence and our parents' blind favoritism to mask his own empty soul. I stopped crying that very day. I grabbed a push broom, swept up the broken, jagged pieces of my engine, and dumped them into the trash. And along with that ruined metal, I swept up the last remaining shreds of hope that I would ever be loved, respected, or protected by these people. I locked my bedroom door that night, stared up at the dark ceiling, and made an ironclad promise to myself. I would erase the Kensington name from my identity. I would forge my own path, and I would never, ever shed another tear for them as long as I lived. 3 days after my 18th birthday, I executed the decision that permanently altered the trajectory of my entire life. In the dead of night, while the massive estate was dead silent and the security guards were swapping shifts, I packed a single faded olive drab canvas backpack. I left behind the designer suits hanging in the closet. I left behind the expensive watches my father had gifted me for photo opportunities. I left the keys to the sports car on my pristine desk. I stripped away every single physical tie to the Kensington fortune. I walked down the long, winding, tree-lined driveway, the cold midnight air biting at my cheeks, without ever looking back at the towering mansion. I did not leave a note. No one woke up to stop me. No one even noticed I was gone until the maid checked my room the next afternoon to gather my laundry. A week later, I marched straight into a Marine Corps recruiting station in a rundown strip mall and eagerly signed away my civilian freedom. I traded my silk bed sheets and silver spoons for a pair of heavy, blister-inducing combat boots and a rifle. The brutal, unforgiving reality of Paris Island pushed me to the utmost limits of human endurance. The contrast was incredibly jarring. I went from walking on heated marble floors to crawling through freezing mud, getting bitten by sand fleas, and having drill instructors scream inches from my face until their voices went hoarse. But boot camp did something my family never could. It systematically rebuilt my shattered self-worth from the ground up, forging a spine of steel where my fear used to be. In the mud and the blood of the obstacle courses, nobody cared about my last name. Nobody cared about my father's offshore bank accounts, his political connections, or the affluent zip code I came from. For the first time in my existence, I was judged strictly by my grit, my refusal to quit, and my fierce loyalty to the recruits suffering right beside me. When I dragged a heavier recruit through a trench filled with freezing water under live barbed wire, ignoring the burning agony in my own lungs, I realized something profound. My inherent empathy was not a disease. It was a vital tactical asset. I learned to channel my years of suppressed anger, the rage from my childhood, into raw, explosive physical stamina. With every agonizing mile run in the pouring rain, carrying a heavy pack, I shed another layer of the worthless, invisible boy my parents had created. Years later, during my second grueling combat deployment in the mountains of Afghanistan, the isolating reality of war momentarily cracked my hardened armored shell. Sitting in a sweltering, dust-filled canvas tent, listening to the distant, terrifying thud of artillery fire shaking the ground, I watched my fellow Marines excitedly tear open letters and packages from their families. Men read notes from their wives, looked at drawings from their children, and shared homemade cookies. In a rare moment of profound weakness, the inner child in me craved just one single word of validation from the bloodline I had left behind. I wrote a brief, stoic letter to my parents, keeping it devoid of emotion, simply stating I was alive, I was fighting on the front lines, and I hoped they were well. I mailed it off and waited. I waited through sandstorms and firefights. Every single week at mail call, I walked up to the distribution table, scanning the massive pile of envelopes for a return address from the estate. And every single week there was nothing. The agonizing silence that followed was a physical blow to my chest, far worse than a punch from my brother. Other Marines received massive care packages stuffed with beef jerky, photographs, and love. I received the deafening, hollow sound of deliberate abandonment. Not a single line, not even a cold, dismissive postcard from an assistant acknowledging their son was surviving in a war zone. That deafening, continuous silence confirmed my worst fear. My bloodline had permanently and intentionally erased me from their narrative. I imagined Declan turning my empty bedroom into another one of his private gyms, laughing with my father at my pathetic attempt to reach out. That unanswered letter was the final nail in the coffin of my past. I mentally burned their address, severing the last fragile, desperate thread tethering me to my toxic history. From that day forward, the military became my true and only family. I poured every ounce of my being into my service. I earned my officer rank through sheer tactical brilliance, leading my men through blistering ambushes, and demonstrating an uncompromising refusal to fail. Pinning the captain's bars to my collar was the ultimate proof of my worth. I became a fortress on the outside, a highly respected commander who never flinched when the bullets flew or the mortars dropped. I found my true brothers in the filthy, blood-stained trenches, forged in extreme trauma. They did not demand aristocratic grace or a heavy wallet. They only demanded I fight as hard to keep them alive as they fought for me. Returning stateside after my final tour of duty, the bitter, sickening reality of how civilian society treats its veterans hit me harder than any enemy ambush I had ever faced. I walked the clean, paved streets of the city and saw men I had fought alongside. Men who had sacrificed their minds, their youth, and their bodies for this country, ending up homeless, addicted, and discarded like trash. The elite class, people wearing tailored suits exactly like my parents and my brother, stepped over these broken heroes on the sidewalks in utter disgust. They averted their eyes, clutching their briefcases tighter, entirely blind to the fact that their luxurious freedom was paid for by the blood of the very men they were ignoring. That sickening injustice fueled a new, burning mission within my soul. It was during this dark period that I reconnected with Orson. Orson was a fierce, grizzled former Marine sergeant who had lost his left leg, diving onto an improvised explosive device to shield his young squad from the blast. He survived, but the VA system had chewed him up and spit him out. Orson became my mentor, my compass, and my true father figure. He understood the specific darkness that only soldiers know. Together, we decided we could not wait for the government or the wealthy elite to fix the problem. We had to act. I marched into the bank, cashed out my entire life savings, my accumulated combat pay, and my military pension. I took every single cent I owned. We found a rusted, sprawling abandoned farm on the outskirts of town, miles away from the city lights, and bought it for $50,000. Working side by side, Orson and I used our own blistered, calloused hands to rebuild the collapsed wooden cabins, repair the rusty plumbing, and clear the overgrown, weed-choked fields. We transformed that forgotten plot of dirt into a dedicated sanctuary for veterans battling severe PTSD, homelessness, and addiction. I named it Camp Freedom. It was not a luxury resort. The roof still leaked a little when it rained heavily, and the old propane heaters rattled constantly in the winter, but it was a fortress of absolute safety. I gave these discarded soldiers a warm place to sleep, a quiet place to heal their fractured minds, and a physical purpose to wake up to every morning. Watching Orson hoist the frayed American flag up the newly painted steel pole gave me an overwhelming, profound sense of peace. I had finally built the secure, loving home I never had, safe and entirely isolated from the destructive, manipulative reach of the Kensington bloodline. For a while, we found a fragile but beautiful rhythm at Camp Freedom. We had 20 veterans living on site. They were attending group therapy sessions under the old oak trees. The vegetable gardens we planted were thriving, providing fresh food for the mess hall. And for the first time in years, the crisp night air was not pierced by the terrifying sound of a grown man screaming from a combat night terror. We were healing. We were building a future. But then, the crisis hit with the sudden, devastating speed of a guided missile strike. Out of nowhere, the city water department drove out and shut off our main water supply, citing a vague, obscure zoning violation from decades ago that made zero logical sense. 2 days later, a thick certified letter arrived in the mail, shattering our hard-earned peace into a million jagged pieces. I opened the heavy envelope in my small, drafty office, my stomach dropping as I read the cold, unforgiving corporate legal jargon printed on the heavy paper. The local bank, without any warning, had quietly sold our remaining property debt. A private corporate shell company had bought it aggressively. It was a predatory, short-term repair loan we had taken out for the roofs, possessing a brutal balloon payment clause that I had been fighting tooth and nail to renegotiate. The new holding company immediately accelerated the deadline, utilizing a buried loophole in the contract. The demand was clear, typed in bold black ink, and merciless. We had exactly 24 hours to produce $50,000 in cash to clear the title and pay off the inflated penalties. If we failed to wire the funds, the property would be legally seized, and demolition bulldozers would arrive at dawn to flatten the cabins. I sat at my battered wooden desk, staring at the terrifying numbers on the page, feeling the exact same icy, suffocating terror I used to feel right before an ambush in a hostile valley. The floor was dropping out from under me. Our sanctuary, the only safe haven these broken men had left in the entire world, was suddenly on the brink of total collapse. And I had absolutely no idea who was pulling the strings. The speed, the precision, and the ferocity of this corporate takeover felt deeply personal. It did not feel like a bank trying to recoup a loss. It felt like a targeted, precision missile strike aimed directly at our foundation. Desperate to find a loophole, a delay, or any legal angle to save my men, I spent the next several hours buried under a mountain of complex legal paperwork. My eyes burned as I dug frantically into the state corporate registry online. I traced the mysterious shell company through a dizzying labyrinth of LLCs, holding groups, and offshore trusts, trying to unmask the faceless billionaire who was actively destroying my home. Finally, deep in the county tax records, buried under 3 layers of sophisticated corporate shielding designed specifically to hide the true owner, I found the parent company. My finger stopped dead on the glowing laptop screen. There, at the bottom of a scanned deed transfer document, was the CEO's signature. The ink was digital, but the handwriting was unmistakable. It was the arrogant, oversized, sweeping cursive letters that I had seen scrawled on 1,000 childhood birthday cards meant for everyone in the family but me. Declan Kensington. The realization hit me like a physical punch directly to the gut, knocking the wind out of my lungs. My brother did not need this cheap, rural, overgrown land. He owned luxury glass high-rises, premium commercial real estate, and elite fitness centers across the entire state. This was not a business acquisition. It was an assassination. He had spent what amounted to pocket change for him, a mere $50,000, to buy my debt specifically to crush my sanctuary out of pure, unadulterated spite. He could not stand the fact that I had built a meaningful life without his permission, a life where I did not bow to the Kensington fortune. While I was staring at his signature, my phone chimed sharply with an encrypted email notification. It was from an anonymous sender, someone claiming to be a mid-level architectural employee at Declan's primary real estate firm. The email was signed only as Soren. Soren wrote that he had been systematically emotionally abused, underpaid, and overworked by Declan for years. He stated he could no longer stomach the sheer cruelty of what his boss was planning to do to a group of disabled veterans. Attached to the email were highly confidential internal memos and detailed architectural blueprints. I opened the files, zooming in on the intricate drawings, and the blood in my veins ran ice cold. Declan was not just evicting us to sell the land for a profit. He had drawn up massive construction plans to bulldoze Camp Freedom and build a massive, state-of-the-art MMA training facility and luxury wellness retreat right on top of our ruins. He literally wanted to pave over the exact spot where our American flagpole stood to build an organic juice bar for his wealthy gym brothers. It was the ultimate sickening betrayal. He wanted to build a towering monument to his own physical vanity on the graves of my brothers in arms, just to prove that my military service and the lives of my veterans were utterly worthless compared to his capitalistic power. Yesterday morning, the final, devastating blow landed. A county sheriff cruiser pulled up to the dirt driveway of the camp, its red and blue lights flashing ominously in the gray dawn. The deputy walked up, avoiding eye contact with any of us, and wordlessly zip-tied a bright red, legally binding eviction notice onto our iron front gate. Tomorrow at 8 in the morning, the property would be seized. The devastating psychological effect on the veterans was immediate and catastrophic. Men who had bravely survived explosive blasts in Fallujah began packing their meager belongings into trash bags with trembling hands. Their eyes went entirely hollow, overwhelmed with the returning, crushing trauma of displacement. I walked the grounds, forcing myself to project absolute calm and steady leadership, until I found Orson. He was sitting in his wheelchair alone by the flagpole, far away from the others. The strongest, most resilient man I had ever known was clutching a faded, crinkled photograph of his fallen squad to his chest, sobbing uncontrollably like a lost, terrified child. The sight of a decorated war hero completely broken by a corrupt, petty billionaire's greed shattered my remaining emotional restraint. The disciplined, stoic Marine captain vanished, replaced by a burning, primal, righteous rage. I realized that passive resistance, legal appeals, and hiding in the woods were no longer options. I could not let these men be discarded like trash for a second time in their lives. Seeing a grown warrior break down entirely destroyed the calm I had spent years building. I marched over to the front gate and violently ripped the bright red eviction notice off the iron bars, gripping the paper so tightly that my knuckles turned bone white. I did not bother changing out of my mud-stained work clothes. I hopped into the cab of my rusted, failing Ford truck, the engine roaring in protest as I slammed the transmission into gear. I knew exactly where my brother was today. It was my parents' massive, highly publicized 40th anniversary party at the family estate. The entire local elite, the politicians, and the billionaires would be there sipping champagne on the manicured lawns. I slammed my heavy combat boot down on the gas pedal, kicking up a massive cloud of dust as I sped away from the camp. I was driving straight back into the toxic, abusive world I had sacrificed everything to escape. I was launching a desperate, one-man rescue mission into hostile territory. The heavy engine of the old Ford roared and sputtered as I sped down the winding highway. My heart hammered against my ribs, driven by a furious, cold adrenaline that narrowed my vision. I had to get that $50,000 today. I was willing to endure whatever twisted psychological torture my family had prepared for me, but I was not going to walk into the lion's den blind. I was a tactician and I needed leverage. I reached for my cracked smartphone on the dashboard and dialed a secure number I had not called in 3 years. It belonged to Blythe, an independent investigative journalist with a fierce reputation for tearing down corrupt corporations and exposing political scandals. More importantly, she was someone whose life I had saved. I had pulled her out of a collapsed, burning building during a brutal, chaotic firefight overseas when she was embedded with our unit. We shared a silent bond forged in dust, debris, and survival. She answered on the second ring, her voice crisp and professional. When I quickly and intensely explained the situation, outlining Declan's shady shell companies, the illegal zoning maneuvers he used to cut our water supply, and the blueprints Soren had leaked, her voice sharpened into a deadly instrument. She revealed that she had been quietly tracking Declan's predatory real estate practices and offshore tax evasions for months, waiting for the perfect, undeniable thread to unravel his empire. I had just handed her that exact thread, wrapped in a human interest story that the media would devour. We formulated a rapid, high-stakes tactical plan over the phone. I would walk straight through the front gates, draw all the attention, and play the role of the desperate, broken brother begging for financial scraps. Meanwhile, she and her discreet, highly professional camera crew would position themselves just outside the perimeter. They would tap into the estate's open guest Wi-Fi network to set up a media blind spot and prepare to broadcast the truth to the world. I am driving straight into my brother's trap, I muttered to myself, gripping the worn leather steering wheel so hard my hands ached as the massive wrought iron gates of the Kensington estate finally came into view. But what that arrogant bastard does not realize is that I am the one setting the snare. As I pulled up to the long, winding paved driveway, seeing the endless line of imported sports cars and luxury sedans parked near the towering crystal fountain, a dark thought crossed my mind. You guys are listening to this right now, hearing exactly how deep this family toxicity goes. I am about to step out of this truck, walk onto that manicured lawn, and face the monster who ruined my childhood. Do you think I should give him one last chance to back down, apologize, and do the right thing behind closed doors? Or does a predator like Declan only understand absolute, undeniable force? Drop your thoughts down in the comments because what happens next is something none of those wealthy guests could have ever prepared for. The rusted, heavy iron gates of the Kensington estate were wide open, welcoming the city elite to my parents' 40th anniversary celebration. My beat-up, faded Ford truck roared as I turned onto the long, winding paved driveway. The squealing, failing brakes entirely shattered the elegant, soft jazz music floating through the warm afternoon air. I aggressively parked my muddy truck right next to a flawless line of imported Italian sports cars and luxury sedans. The valets, dressed in crisp white uniforms, stared at my vehicle in sheer horror, frozen in place as if a bomb had just been dropped on the driveway. I killed the sputtering engine, the truck giving one final, violently loud exhaust backfire that echoed across the grounds. I pushed open the creaking door and stepped out into the pristine environment. I was wearing my heavily mud-stained work jacket, faded denim jeans, and battered combat boots. The visual contrast was intentionally jarring. The massive back lawn was a sea of tailored tuxedos, glittering evening gowns, and expensive diamond jewelry sparkling in the sunlight. As I walked heavily toward the center of the party, the crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. Their faces, usually frozen in polite, high society smiles, twisted into masks of unrestrained disgust. My dirty boots tracked soil onto the flawless stone pathways. I could hear their harsh, judgmental whispers rippling through the crowd. They stared at me as if a rabid, diseased animal had just wandered into their exclusive sanctuary. I kept my eyes locked straight ahead, ignoring their revulsion. My military training allowed me to tune out the white noise of the crowd, focusing entirely on my primary objective. I had to find my brother, swallow my pride, and secure the $50,000 to save Orson and the men. Every step I took was a violation of their perfectly curated world, but I did not care about their delicate sensibilities. I only cared about the eviction notice burning a hole in my pocket. Before I could even reach the outdoor marble bar where Declan was holding court, my father spotted me. Alistair abruptly abandoned a circle of wealthy politicians, his face turning a furious, embarrassed shade of crimson. He marched up to me, aggressively blocking my path. His eyes blazed with the same familiar contempt he had shown me since childhood. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not care that I looked exhausted, battered by life, and desperate. He leaned in, his voice a low hiss designed to avoid a public scene, but sharp enough that every word felt like a poisoned needle sliding into my ribs. "Are you here to smear my name on this day, Hayes?" he demanded, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and cigars. Before I could respond, my mother stepped forward, her silk dress rustling. She did not bother lowering her voice. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my face, her tone shrieking with a deeply ingrained venom that cut clearly through the sudden silence of the surrounding crowd. "Go back to that garbage dump with your crippled soldiers," she spat, her face contorting with rage. "You are ruining my anniversary." Hearing my own mother publicly degrade the bravest men I had ever known was a sickening blow. They were more offended by the dirt on my jacket than they were by the fact that their own son was standing in front of them, fighting for his life's work. It was the ultimate confirmation that the Kensington family crest was built entirely on vanity. I swallowed my burning pride, biting my tongue so hard I could taste the metallic tang of blood in my mouth. I ignored my parents' venomous insults, sidestepping them to walk straight up to my brother. He was standing by the bar, his massive, muscular frame casually leaning against the marble counter. His arms were crossed over his tailored suit, and a smug, victorious grin was plastered across his face. He knew exactly why I was here. I looked him dead in the eye, stripping away every ounce of my Marine Corps ego, and laid myself bare before my lifelong abuser. "Declan, write the $50,000 check to clear the loan," I said, my voice tight with a desperation I had sworn never to show him again. "I will pay you back with interest. Just stop the auction, please." Next to him, our Aunt Delphine dramatically whipped out a silk handkerchief and covered her nose, rolling her eyes for the benefit of the watching guests. "Kick him out, Declan," she sneered loudly. "His stench is making me nauseous." The crowd murmured in agreement, fully supporting her cruelty. I did not blink. I kept my eyes locked on my brother, waiting for his judgment. I was willing to endure whatever psychological torture he demanded, if it meant Orson would not sleep on the street tomorrow. My brother threw his head back and laughed, a booming, theatrical laugh designed to draw the attention of every single guest at the party. He slowly reached into his tailored jacket, pulled out a heavy leather checkbook, and scrawled his signature with a gold pen. He tore the check for $50,000 free. With deliberate disrespect, he threw it directly onto the dirt and grass at my feet. "You want $50,000 to save that garbage dump full of your broken veterans?" He sneered, his voice dripping with malice. "Step in here and survive 3 minutes in the ring with me. If you drop before the timer runs out, I will personally drive the bulldozer tomorrow morning and flatten that camp." The crowd gasped, but quickly shifted into excited, bloodthirsty whispers. My dad, instead of stopping the madness, raised his crystal wine glass to the crowd in enthusiastic agreement. "Teach him a lesson, Declan," Alistair cheered, fully endorsing the public beating of his own son. "Let him wake up from his delusion." I looked down at the small piece of paper resting in the dirt. I thought of Orson's tears, the flag snapping in the wind, and the men who relied on me. I did not argue. I did not scream. I quietly nodded, accepting the brutal terms of this blood contract. The wealthy elite guests eagerly formed a wide, bloodthirsty circle on the manicured lawn, holding their champagne flutes tight, as if they were watching a gladiator match in ancient Rome. My parents took prime VIP seats on the patio, swirling their drinks in excited anticipation of my impending physical punishment. I stood in the center of the grass, the weight of their collective hatred pressing down on me. I slowly, clumsily bent down and began to undo the thick, muddy laces of my heavy combat boots. I slid them off, tossing them aside. My bare feet stepped onto the imported soft grass, and the visual contrast was stark. I deliberately hunched my shoulders forward, allowing my spine to curve, feigning the exhausted, terrified posture of a helpless victim. My brother stepped into the makeshift ring, tossing his expensive suit jacket to a waiter. He cracked his knuckles loudly, his massive 6'4" frame towering over me. He looked at my bowed head, fully believing he was about to get 180 seconds to torture a pathetic lamb. I looked up straight into his eyes, dropping the facade for just a fraction of a second, and my lips curled slightly. "Are you sure you can last 3 minutes?" The quiet, chilling confidence in my voice barely registered in his arrogant mind, drowned out by the cheering of the sycophants surrounding us. Richard, the aging family butler, stepped hesitantly into the center of the circle. His hands were visibly trembling as he looked between my brother's massive muscular physique and my seemingly fragile frame. With a voice that cracked with nervous reluctance, Richard shouted to begin the match. Instantly, the illusion of a fair fight evaporated. My brother roared like a wild animal and lunged forward with terrifying, practiced MMA speed. He was blinded by his own towering arrogance, fully expecting zero resistance from a man he considered nothing more than a broken runaway. He did not bother to throw a probing jab or test my distance. He went straight for the kill. Shifting his massive weight, he threw a devastating, bone-shattering overhand right punch aimed directly at the center of my face. He fully intended to end this joke of a match in the first 3 seconds, wanting a quick, brutal knockout to satisfy his audience and cement his dominance. The sheer kinetic energy behind his fist was enough to shatter a normal person's jaw into a dozen pieces. The crowd collectively held their breath, waiting for the sickening sound of my collapse. Time seemed to dilate, slowing down to a crawl as his fist closed the distance. His eyes were wide with a sadistic joy that he was finally legally allowed to destroy me. I did not dodge. I did not flinch, step back, or raise my hands in a frantic panic. By violently forcing my own posture against every natural human instinct, I rapidly tucked my chin to my chest and angled my head downward. I actively chose to take the massive heavyweight blow directly on the hardest, thickest part of my skull, the crown of my forehead. A sickening, bone-jarring crack echoed sharply through the quiet yard, loud enough to make several guests gasp in horror. My brother stumbled backward with a sharp hiss of pain, clutching his bruised knuckles. A flash of blinding white light exploded behind my retinas, and warm metallic blood instantly filled my mouth as my lips split against my teeth. The concussive force rattled my brain, but the blinding pain did not break me. It did exactly what I needed it to do. It successfully flipped my military killer switch. The exhausted, begging, victimized brother vanished entirely into the ether. My nervous system locked onto the target. The adrenaline of the battlefield flooded my veins, replacing my fear with terrifying clarity. I was no longer a civilian asking for a loan. I was a highly trained Marine close-quarters combat specialist, and I was now an active weapon. The pain was an old friend, a familiar metric that told me I was still breathing, still fighting, and that the man standing across from me had just made a fatal miscalculation. Furious and deeply confused that I was still standing, my brother's face twisted into an ugly mask of pure rage. He rapidly regained his balance and, abandoning any pretense of restraint, rushed in, forcing a frantic, chaotic clinch. In the desperate tangle of limbs, he abandoned any sportsmanship and drove a cowardly, brutal knee strike right up into my exposed left side. The impact was devastating. A sickening, bone-snapping crack echoed sharply over the lawn, loud enough to cut through the heavy silence. My lower ribs splintered instantly, sending a wave of blinding, white-hot agony tearing through my chest. From the sidelines, Aunt Delphine let out a high-pitched shriek of delight. To my disgust, my own father actually clapped his hands in enthusiastic applause, openly cheering for my physical destruction. But they fundamentally misunderstood the nature of my pain. On the battlefield, pain is just a tactical catalyst. I violently refused to give them the satisfaction of a wince or a scream. I bit down on my lip so hard it bled again, absorbing the agonizing fire in my torso and channeling it directly into my fists. The predator had just become the prey. Ignoring the searing fire tearing through my fractured rib cage, I executed a lethal counterstrike trained into my muscle memory 1,000 times. Before he could pull his knee back, I plunged my stiffened, spear-like fingers straight into the soft, vulnerable hollow of his throat. He gagged violently, his eyes bulging in sudden terror as his airway was instantly compromised. His vice-like grip on my arms loosened as panic set in. I grabbed a fistful of his slick, sweat-drenched hair, yanked his heavy head violently backward, and delivered a devastating military crossface strike directly to the side of his chin. The concentrated force of my forearm slamming into his jaw short-circuited his equilibrium. Without missing a beat, I swept his lead leg, slamming his massive heavyweight frame to the dirt. The pristine lawn, once the symbol of my family's untouchable aristocracy, was now a designated combat zone, stained with mud and spilled alcohol. My brother lay flat on his back, gasping for air, staring up at the sky in a state of absolute shock. His millions of dollars in the bank, his luxury sports cars, and his parents' adoration could do nothing to protect him from the harsh reality of physical domination. Moving with terrifying, lethal military precision, I did not let him recover. I immediately dropped my weight and slid into a full, inescapable mount directly on his massive chest, pinning his arms beneath my knees. The surrounding crowd was dead, suffocatingly silent. Not a single person, not even my father, dared to intervene or speak. I slipped my bloodied hands past his desperate defense and applied a brutal, bare-handed Ezekiel choke. I locked my forearms together, driving the point of my chin directly into his eye socket for leverage, and crushed my wrists against his carotid artery, instantly cutting off the blood flow to his brain. He panicked. His massive hands scratched wildly at my forearms, his fingernails gouging deep, bloody lines into my skin. But I did not flinch. I just continued to breathe steadily, staring directly down into his bulging, terrified eyes. 10, 9, 8. I whispered audibly, counting down his demise so only he could hear it. His violent struggles grew weaker by the second. His face turned a deep, bruised purple, and his eyes slowly began to roll back into his head. The mighty undefeated MMA champion, the arrogant golden boy of the Kensington family, raised his trembling hand and weakly tapped out on my shoulder in undeniable disgrace. The tapping was the sweetest sound I had heard in 20 years. I held the choke for exactly 1 second longer than necessary, just long enough to make him truly understand that his life was entirely in my hands, and that I was sparing him out of pity, not love. I instantly released the hold, uncoiling from his chest and standing up in one fluid motion. My brother rolled onto his side, gagging, sputtering, and coughing violently into the torn, muddy grass. His massive ego was shattered into a million irreparable pieces. As he greedily gasped for oxygen, crying tears of physical panic, he finally realized a devastating truth. His shiny, heavily marketed gym martial arts were a laughable joke compared to the merciless life or death reality of survival combat. The absolute humiliation of publicly tapping out to his estranged brother stripped away every ounce of his manufactured alpha male bravado. Just as the crowd began to process the sheer trauma of what they had witnessed, the heavy wooden side gates of the garden swung open. Blythe, the investigative journalist, marched onto the lawn, followed by a professional camera crew. A red recording light glowed brightly on the main camera. They had captured everything. They had live-streamed the entire confrontation, from Declan throwing the check and making his extortionate demand, to the brutal, unprovoked assault and finally, his pathetic submission. Thank you so much for sticking with the story this far. If you are glad I finally put my bully of a brother in his place, drop a W in the comments down below. That stands for win, for those of you who have watched until this exact moment, and I will be hearting and replying to every single comment that has the W keyword. The soft jazz music was completely dead, likely unplugged by a panicked caterer. The night air hung thick, heavy with the scent of trampled grass and spilled champagne. Blythe stood tall in the center of the lawn, holding a microphone, her voice projecting clearly over the stunned guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," Blythe announced, her tone sharp and unyielding. "What you just witnessed on this lawn was broadcast live to over 50,000 viewers across multiple news platforms. We have also just published the leaked internal documents proving that Declan Kensington illegally manipulated zoning laws, shut off the water supply to a disabled veteran facility, and attempted to unlawfully seize a protected property for his own commercial gain." The massive crowd of politicians, socialites, and billionaires froze in a state of absolute horror. They were not horrified by the violence anymore. They were horrified that they had been caught on camera cheering for it. The guests, people who guarded their public relations images with their lives, instantly began to distance themselves. Politicians physically stepped away from my father. Socialites turned their backs on my mother, muttering frantic excuses as they rushed toward the exit to avoid the camera lenses. My dad and mom stood paralyzed by their velvet VIP chairs. They stared at me, then at the camera crew, their faces drained of all color. The empire of reputation they had spent 40 years building was disintegrating in real time on the internet. Richard, the aging family butler, was the only person brave enough to break the suffocating tension. He approached me slowly, his polished black shoes crunching softly against the ruined grass. His hands were trembling, but his eyes held a mixture of fear and profound, unspoken respect. He reached down and picked up the crumpled, slightly mud-stained $50,000 check from the ground. He held it out to me. He had worked for this family for decades. He knew exactly how much abuse I had suffered, and he had just watched me conquer my lifelong tormentor. I snatched the check from his trembling fingers without saying a single word. That is when Blythe dropped the final, devastating bombshell. "Oh, and Declan?" she called out to my brother, who was still kneeling in the dirt, clutching his bruised throat. "My legal team ran a check on that parcel of land you tried to steal. It turns out Camp Freedom sits on a protected military heritage site designated by the state in 1982. Your shell company purchase is federally void. You do not own the land. You never did. So that $50,000 check you just signed in front of thousands of witnesses? Our lawyers will be processing that as a formal apology and compensation for the emotional distress and plumbing damages you caused those veterans." The financial ransom had been paid in full, extracted not through begging, but through tactical superiority. The transaction was complete. I did not owe Alistair, Rowena, or Declan Kensington anything ever again. Ignoring the searing pain shooting through my broken rib, I slowly bent down and laced up my battered heavy combat boots. I stood at full attention, my spine straight, and swept a cold, disgusted glare across the entire patio. I looked at my humiliated brother. I looked at my parents, letting them see the absolute chilling void where my desperate need for their love used to reside. I did not offer a parting speech. I did not shed a single tear. Without uttering a word, I turned my back on my bloodline forever and walked away. The iron gates of the estate closed behind me with a resounding metallic clang, a physical manifestation of the boundary I had just permanently erected. Inside the rusted cabin of my Ford truck, the explosive combat adrenaline finally began to fade, replaced by a crashing wave of sheer physical exhaustion. Every time the heavy tires hit a pothole on the dark, winding highway, my cracked ribs screamed in blinding, white-hot agony, sending sharp gasps tearing through my bruised chest. My knuckles were swollen, and the split on my lower lip continued to drip warm blood onto my collar. But my right fist was tightly, stubbornly closed around that folded check in my pocket, holding onto it like a lifeline. The physical agony radiating through my torso was an incredibly cheap, gladly paid price for our freedom. I rolled down the window, letting the freezing, biting night air rush into the cabin, actively washing away the suffocating scent of expensive cologne that clung to my skin. For the first time in my life, the road ahead did not feel like an escape route. It felt like a purposeful march toward a genuine future. The silence in the truck was profoundly peaceful. I was driving away from a mansion filled with strangers and heading toward a dilapidated farm filled with my true family. Dawn was just beginning to break over the rugged horizon in bruised streaks of gold and deep purple as I finally pulled up to the rusted iron gates of Camp Freedom. The terrifying threat of the heavy machinery was gone. The morning mist hung low over the quiet, peaceful cabins. Sitting exactly where I had left him yesterday, wrapped in a thick wool blanket by the entrance, was Orson. His wheelchair was parked facing the road, having kept a desperate, sleepless vigil throughout the freezing night. His weathered face looked pale, and his eyes were red and swollen from crying, fully believing our sanctuary was doomed. He looked up at the sound of my squealing brakes. I killed the engine and sat in the cab for a long moment, taking a deep, ragged breath to compose myself, hiding the grimace of pain. I wiped the dried blood from my chin, pulled my jacket tight to conceal the bulge of my fractured rib, and stepped out. The smell of wet earth and pine needles instantly grounded me. Orson saw me moving with a stiff, heavy limp, my face battered and bruised. His eyes widened in shock, but the terror instantly melted into a radiant, tearful smile of pure relief just seeing that I had returned alive. He reached out his scarred hands toward me. I walked over, forced myself to stand upright, and placed the folded $50,000 check gently into his palms. "We are safe, Orson," I whispered softly, my voice raspy. The camp belongs to us. No one is ever taking it away. And we have enough here to fix the roofs properly. The old warrior looked down at the check, fresh, silent tears spilling over his cheeks. He reached up, gripping my shoulder with a fierce, trembling strength. In his tear-filled eyes, I saw the unconditional love, respect, and pride that my biological father had violently withheld my entire life. Still holding my injured side, I stepped back and looked up at the tall white flag pole in the center of the camp. The weathered American flag was snapping fiercely in the cold morning wind, illuminated brilliantly by the rising sun. Staring up at those stars and stripes, a profound realization washed over me. I had fought a brutal, bloody war on a manicured lawn entirely alone, and I had successfully protected my real family. The Kensington bloodline, with all its millions of dollars and bottomless cruelty, had ultimately lost to the unbreakable willpower of a discarded soldier. The scars on my feet, the fracture in my chest, and the bruises on my face were not marks of victimhood. They were the hard-earned medals of my ultimate liberation. I did not need a family crest above my fireplace. I had something my brother could never buy. I had people who would bleed for me because I had bled for them first. I bathed in the golden light of the sunrise, stepping confidently into a future where I was unapologetically free. I left my brother broken on the grass, and I allowed a journalist to destroy my parents' public empire to save the men who mattered to me. Some might say I went too far by destroying my own bloodline on live camera. What do you think? Did I cross a line? Or was this exactly the justice they deserved? Let me know your verdict in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of surviving the unimaginable.